Okay, we are live. Jared decided that he's going to uh, reveal his face today. We're going to be redoing our discussion on the Chinese and the Judaic influence on their culture and the Chinese Jewish population and I believe how it ended up creating communism. And as you can see Jared's face. He looks like every single electrical contractor you've ever seen. Um, so whenever you're ready, we're going to be going through this article from a website called fitzinfo.net, and it's fitzinfo.net, and their article is um, how uh, they took over China and created Chinese communism. So, without further ado, let's get to it.
Thank you for having me. As always, Dylan, it's always a pleasure when we get a chance to connect. I'm excited to present this topic today, um, courtesy of fitzinfo.net, as stated. And we're going to be getting into a history of Jews in China and where we find ourselves today. We're going to discuss early Jews in China. We're going to discuss some of these particular families. We'll get into the Opium Wars, the Century of Humiliation, um, U.S. Uh, manufacturing being shipped off to China, and communism. And I think it's going to be a great discussion. And I want to thank Josh from fitzinfo.net and the Fitzpatrick Informer for putting this article together. But yeah, let's dive into it. So some people say that the history of Jews in China goes back um, a few millennia. Some say that it goes back at least 1,000 years. But what is most often cited is the Jews of Kaifeng, the Kaifeng Jews. So China has a long and complex Jewish history that traces at least back to the 18th century, pardon me, the 8th century. And there's a, a letter that was written in the Judeo-Persian language, which was found by a Mark Aurel Stein, and it's written in Hebrew, and it dates back to the late 8th century, early ninth century. And these Jews had um, their own synagogue, their own surnames, which we'll get into, and they were influential in many ways, not just in helping create the first paper money, which is an interesting conversation, but they had roles in government. They were advisors. They were involved in military affairs and were quite influential through various dynasties. One dynasty itself is named after one of these Jewish families. That would be the Zhou dynasty, Zhou. So it's fair to say they've been involved in Chinese history, development, and where they're placed in the modern world and their role we see them today. And let's start getting into the details and minutia of these things.
And
So,
also, like when I did my video a few months back about what was going on with South America, I believe, and the the burning of the Patagonia,
Patagonia, yeah,
and there was a group that I found that was tied in like an NGO, and this kind of just reminded me of how they have a group that goes to different foreign countries to uh, I don't know the modus operandi completely, but they essentially go and try to find long lost uh, Jewish members, or Jewish groups in all sorts of different countries. It's like they end up in Costa Rica and end up in these African countries, and I'm wondering, um, not that I dis you know, not that I'm just d- thinking it disproves anything, but thinking about this picture of this scroll or scrolling found by this Mark Orlstein, saying that it's dated to the early ninth or 8th century. I wonder how real that is, or how much of history they set up in like finding artifacts to say that they have a claim in these different countries.
that's an interesting thing to bring up. Now that you mention that, they do this in the Levant in Palestine. They go around, they dig holes, they place artifacts in areas that will be found because there's planning for residential developments or expansion into former settlements of people that have been displaced. And in doing so, once these areas begin to undergo excavation, they say, "Oh, look, here are Jewish artifacts." So it that very well could be the case with some of these things that are presented at times, like this piece of paper that was found by a Jew documenting Jewish history in China. But
I'm
this
wondering
also
if
leads me.
that's why they had like ISIS blow up that one. There was a really ornate uh, temple or mosque or something. I don't remember what it was, carved out of the side of a this rock cliff. I can't remember what it was called, um, and for whatever reason they just went and destroyed it. And ISIS going around destroying all these images and these carvings. It's like it really does help in like help them to go and remove aspects of history so that can
Sure.
be. And then when you like thinking about that, when didn't weren't you saying something about like there's that quote about like Islam being like the broom,
The
and
broom. Yeah.
like basically sweeping up things so that they can retell history by just destroying old evidence.
100%. This is a case in practice. It's very common. Um, the United States, during its involvement in the Afghanistan and Iraq war, they were going around looting museums, destroying artifacts. The Taliban itself was destroying sites associated with Buddhism. And it's always in an attempt to rewrite the narrative. And we know who loves to rewrite the narrative and control thought, conversations. and discussions revolving around certain topics. This is why there's a wall built around the pool at Auschwitz. So it again, when people go and visit it, they are unable to see that there was a swimming pool. Um, but one of the things we can find is throughout history, there tends to be a degree of documentation that's often found in lore and mythology. And this conversation reminded me of the Tengu. The Tengu is a demon or a kami in
Japan.
Japanese mythology associated with imagery that's very reminiscent of an Orthodox Jew. The manner in which it's depicted, its nose, its phylactery, the black box that um, Talmudic and Kabbalah practicing Jews tie to their wrist with leather banding, and their forehead, in which they place a prayer. The Tengu carry something called the Torah no Maki, which translates to Torah scroll. So again, Jews in East Asia, um, being associated with a Torah scroll and a particular demon in their folklore.
Okay, so
So
let's get back to the thing. I didn't mean to go off that far.
no, no, no. And a small digression from time to time never hurts. But yeah. That said, it's quite evident that Jews made their way east, and um, one of the things we'll discuss is that some of these Jews in China, when their religious practices were observed by other Jews, they noticed that they um, most likely arrived prior to the destruction of the Second Temple, because they didn't observe particular holidays, high holidays associated with Judaism. So um, that said, um, there's influence all along the Silk Road and into China, and particularly Kaifeng around the 8th, 9th century. And there's, again, multiple families. And there's the House of Zhao under the Zhong dynasty. There is the Zhou dynasty, Zhou, which is one of these 13 Jewish families we'll discuss. The first premier, the first prime minister of communist China was of these bloodlines. The I looked up the list of the 10 richest um, Chinamen, and found that three of them were of these Chinese Jewish surnames. So that there's plenty of evidence. Some of the evidence we're going to discuss is from Jews themselves. Like there's a newspaper called the Jewish Post out of Indianapolis, and on the 12th of September in 1984, they stated it is thought that Zhao Yiyang, Prime Minister of the People's Republic of China, may be a descendant of a prominent Chinese clan that practiced Judaism. This substantiates the claims of 13 Jewish surnames who are quite prevalent and influential in China. As we'll get into a little bit later about who some of these people are. The creator of TikTok, and from China, was again one of these Chinese Jews. It was observed by Marco Polo during his travels in in the 13th century, 1200s. He was in China for 17 years and he noticed that Jews had a noticeable amount of political influence. So, um, it it's quite clear once we start digging into these things, that we'll see the reason for communist China was Jews, the reason for sending American manufacturing to China was the result of Jewish relations between American Jews and Chinese Jews. And when you when you turn over a rock and start doing research, whether it be feminism, communism, LGBTQ movement, you'll often find a Jew. And it's not to say every single Jew's terrible and they need to you know go the way of the dodo. The idea is that there is a coordinated effort by these Jews. So um, some of the observations by Marco Polo, as stated, that Jews were sufficient enough to be able to exert political influence in China. According to the American Jewish World and their newspaper or magazine, whichever it may be, they wrote on the 9th of April in 1976. We who lived in China knew that the Chinese were a rare breed of people whose history was never stained by persecution of the Jews. We knew from Marco Polo that the China of his day had a large Jewish community whose origin is shrouded in mystery. For to this day, no one knows where they came from or how they established themselves. There is merchants and administrators who enjoyed the esteem of their neighbors. So,
It's very interesting thinking about Marco Polo and him being famous for bringing back the noodles back to
yeah,
Italy,
yeah, pasta. Yeah.
and then thinking about how like history repeats with the Belt and Road initiative, and how it really could explain why all the money is starting to go to China and they're abandoning the West. Um, and they are basically giving like Trump and these idiots in our governments that are ruling over us like one last chance to keep things over here and be amicable. Otherwise, their full new setup is to abandon the West and move east
Yep.
and basically redo the Silk Road.
100%. And one thing we often find amongst amongst these people, amongst these Jews, is that they go from one nation to the next. They milk it for what it's worth, and when the cow becomes old, decrepit, and broken down and no longer worth milking, they move to another.
What's
And it's
Hashisim?
um
Drew in the chat was talking about Hashisim. He said Marco Polo brought the Illuminati and Hashisim.
I do not know Hashisam.
I'll look that
That's
up while you're talking.
100% appreciate it. Any comments or anyone, if there's anything anyone has to contribute to
Oh,
this,
okay.
I encourage them.
It's essentially like a way of like being an assassin. It's like a
Oh
assassination
yeah,
targeting killings and stealth and psychological warfare against
I
politicians.
I am familiar with the assassins and that particular story, and I don't want to get into much of a digression, but they would um tr give them drugs and like opium, cannabis, um lotus flower combination. They'd pass out and they'd wake up in these gardens that had tigers and peacocks and animals from, distant lands, and they would have, beautiful women around naked, and they'd explain to them that they had woken up in paradise, and then they'd make them pass out again. And once they came to, they'd say, "Hey, man, you work for me. I can make sure you get back there." And it was a practice of creating followers for a particular individual. I forget his name, but yeah, it was practiced and came about in the Middle East. But yeah, these Kaifeng Jews, who were documented by this Mark Orlstein, um, these Kaifeng Jews began to rise in influence and reach a level of success that kind of rivals any story of Jewish prosperity, um, and can be paralleled to what's seen in America today, or England, or Argentina, with people like Javier Milei. But during the Ming Dynasty, Jewish life thrived, and the Jewish people of Kaifeng were an affluent group. By the 16th century, it's stated. So during the period of the Ming Dynasty, the Jewish community entered a golden age, and they were fully encouraged to participate in society, including public affairs and government service. And the Ming Dynasty had clearly close relationships with these Jews, so much so that 7 surnames were assigned to these Jews, and some of these names are still known today. The Ming Emperor assigned the following names: I, AI, Shi, SHI, Gao, GAO, Jin, JIN, Li, LI, Zhang, ZHANG, and Zhao, ZHAO. And of these, Jin and Shi were reminiscent of Western Jewish surnames like Gold and Stone. And there's a 1489 inscription that lists 7 others: Yen, YEN, Kao, KAO, Mu, MU, Huang, HUANG, Ni, NIE, An, AN, Zhu, ZUO, Bai, BAI, and Zhao, ZHOU. So some think that only about 7 of these names survived after 1642, but I'm sure that's debatable. And again, we find another post from the another article by the Jewish Post of Indianapolis, fa which was dated on the 19th of October, 1988, on page 19, which states when Kaifeng flourished from 960 to 1644, its Jewish population numbered 4,000. The former curator of the Kaifeng Museum, historian Wang Yisha, told Bush that the Jews contributed well beyond their numbers, making Kaifeng a great city. The Jewish people found it was very easy to adapt to the doctrines of Confucius. We'll see that they were also involved in Confucianism and its spread. Chinese society had climbed the ladder of success. They were doctors, farmers, scholars, and even high ranking military officers. They were never oppressed or harassed as Jews and adopted Chinese names. So, again, this is a Jewish article by the Jewish Post of Indianapolis from 1988. So, after the fall of the Ming Dynasty, um, to a rebel army led by Li Zicheng, It's important to mention this rebel army led by Zichang. Li, Li, is one of these Jewish surnames. When discussing Chinese family names and Chinese names in general, the first name, like Li Zicheng, Li is the last name, as it would be in the West. So that's important to preface. So there was a after the fall of the Ming Dynasty by this rebel army led by this Chinese Jew, there was a short-lived dynasty which reigned for 5 years and was eventually replaced by the Qing Dynasty, uh, Qing, and it happened that some Kaifeng Jews and descendants of the House of Zhao, Zhao, Zhao Yingchang and his brother Zhao Yingdu, um, held important government posts in the 1660s under the newly formed Qing dynasty. Um, Zhao Yingchang and his brother were also instrumental in rebuilding the synagogue that was destroyed in a flood of 1642. So this article is more or less in alignment with my view of how Jews operate, and that it's paramount to understand that these Jews operate like your average religious Jew you see in America or anywhere else. To give an example, the Jews of China in the 19th century were observed to marry um, wives of their own religion and stuck with their own people. And since Kaifeng Jews were like this during the 19th century, it's safe to say they were doing this same practice in the preceding centuries, considering we know these facts, same religion, same practices, and emphasis on growing their population and influence. So these Chinese Jews are totally assimilated into Chinese culture. Um, they appear Chinese. If you were to see one, they wouldn't look like your Grabler or your Rabbi Shmuley. If you were to take a peek at them, they looked like the average Chinaman. So there's an academic article in the journal The Leisure Hour on the Jews of China, and on page 333 states the Jews of China, 1867, they, the Chinese Jews, kept their faith with the characteristic tenacity that distinguishes the Hebrew race, and even now only marry wives of their own religion. So that although they may, in appearance, outwardly as merchants or um, consultant roles, government and military, appeared to be Chinese, like the Donmei of Turkey, who appeared to be Muslim, or the conversos of Spain, who appeared to be Catholics. They continued to operate in secret and behind closed doors and practice Judaism. And it's fair to say, based on um, just assumptions, that they probably also practiced Kabbalah and revered the Talmud, as many Jews do. When in diaspora, they tend to cling heavily and lean on old Jewish traditions rather than assimilate into the the population. I doubt at home they were um, practicing, Confucianism or Tao. And as we'll see, they were involved in spreading Confucianism. So there's a historian by the name of Henry Hart Millman who states these Chinese Jews had cultivated learning with success, and some of them, as it was attested by extant inscriptions, had been highly honored with imperial favor and had attained the rank of mandarins. One of these inscriptions, dated 1515, praises the Jews for their integrity and fidelity in agriculture, commerce, magistracy, and in the army, and for the adequate observance of their own religious ceremonies. He then goes on to say, in other aspects, they are strictly Jews. They only marry among themselves. They neither make nor attempt to make proselytize. So they don't proselytize. They don't try and convert the Chinese to Judaism. They operate as Jews do. So, uh, as stated, they may look to be Chinese, but I mean, they may appear to be Chinese, but they're Jewish. And Dylan may or may not pull up the image of a Kaifeng Jew, which was photographed in 1919, and they just look like your standard Chinaman. So there's a piece written by a Mr. Fahey. I want to say Father Fahey, it may be. Um, can't say for sure, but
Yeah, it's Father Fahey. I believe I looked this up before.
and I would assume probably a member of the Catholic Church, possibly a Jesuit. Fahey goes on to say the members of the Jewish nation, while retaining their allegiance to their own nation, are also citizens of other nations. Given the messianic aspirations of their own nation, they are bound to strive for the domination of their nation over the others, as they are firmly convinced that in this way alone justice and peace will reign upon the earth. The positions attained by them in the councils and legislative assemblies of other nations must logically be for them, at least primarily, means for advancing the domination of their own people. When they assist as secretaries of Lloyd George and Clemenceau, an advisor of President Wilson, then we know that English, French, and American citizenship will be utilized for the furtherance of interests of a nation that believes firmly that English, French, and Americans are destined by God to be subject to it. And this gets into the ideas which are found in the Talmud and the Zohar that Jews will take over the world, um, institute Noahide laws, and they'll get 2,800 slaves each. So there's a saying by a particular Jew. I'm not going to zoom in on this to get his name because it's kind of a pain in the ass, but he says there are no French, English, German, or American Jews, but only Jews living in England, France, Germany, or America.
It's
So
Chaim
this,
Wiseman.
okay. And that lays down the approach that these Jews have when making their way into a society. It's not to live peacefully among the locals and become members of the communities. They seek to um, gain positions of power to exert their Jewish control, and it's no different with Chinese Jews. So the fact of the matter is that Jews have always banded together as a tribe, have worked vigorously to infiltrate governments, and they've monopolized financial systems of nations. They've instigated wars and worked to intentionally create chaos and division in societies. The international media, being in the hands of the Jews, will never be the ones to shed light on this. And it's just a simple fact of life. As stated, the individual responsible for creating TikTok is a Jew. So eventually it was purchased, if I'm not mistaken, by a conglomerate or a subsidiary of one of Larry Ellison's um, holdings. And if I'm not mistaken,
Yeah, that's true.
his son may be running that particular operation, but they're their main goal is always to have um, control over the narrative, as we've presented here on um, many an episode. Media and the discussion and the narrative and the common perception of what and who a Jew is something they seek to control. So from everything that's been gathered and displayed, it's fair to say the Jews were quite successful and held positions of influence and power for centuries in China, and all the while maintaining their classic tribal Jewish behavior. And this allows the Jew to grow in numbers and exponentially increase that influence. So there was a Jewish officer who happened to be in China in 1864. He was in the British Navy, and he estimated that Chinese Jews totaled around 1 million individuals. Some say that number's lower, some say that number's higher. Jews do not like to be counted. Um, I believe there's something in the Torah somewhere that states that they would number, the sands of the sand grains on a beach. But they're not the biggest fan of being numbered unless it's counting them at particular summer camps in in Eastern Europe. But that's a digression. So there was another person who stated that these Jews number nearly 5 million. There was a Mr. Sauce who gave a report to the New York Times correspondent to a New York Times correspondent, stating there was nearly 5 million Jews in China. And not only that, but the Jews were successful and honored with many high standing statuses in society. So just to read a little bit of this article, there are nearly 5 million Jews in China who speak the language and the Chinese fluently, who wear um, clothing and strictly adhere to all the ordinary customs and dress of Chinese culture. When I arrived in Shanghai, I made the acquaintance of a Chinese Jew of high standing. He said that the Jews came to China 3,000 years ago, and that their religion has been handed down through the ages. They have adopted, he said, all the Chinese customs and speak the language fluently, if not more so as they do Hebrew. This old fellow introduced me to many Jews, and he said they all spoke the Hebrew language. I had no difficulty in conversing with them. I was shown a number of synagogues about the city and learned that the ritual is similar to that used by Jews all over the world. Saturday is a holiday for them, and they observe all the other Jewish holidays. The Jew is honored more in China than he has in any other country in the world. In fact, the Chinese, who are heathens, are more quickly converted to the religion that they are to Christianity. If a Jew has a complaint to make, he is given every consideration by the government. So this was a correspondent and a report made by the New York Times. Um, it's a little bit too small for me to be able to see what year that is. So the success of Chinese Jews in the early 1900s is attested to in
That
the
was
following
from
newspaper.
February of 1903.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate you zooming in on that. They're said to be Chinese Jewish colony on the Yangtze River Valley in China. The colony has existed since 200 years before the Christian era. So it's fair to say 200 BC. They have a synagogue in which they attend. They worship and extract the sinews from flesh. That was actually the name um, given to describe these Chinese Jews. It's they who remove the sinew, which is a practice found in the kosher slaughter of animals. So it goes on to say that they extract the sinews from the flesh before eating it, erect tablets to Moses and Abraham, and are called by some blue-capped Mohammedans because of their blue headdress. Others, otherwise, there's very little difference from other Chinese citizens. They hold high offices in the land at times and because of Chinese tolerant principles, have never been persecuted or oppressed. So there's a rabbi by Jacob S. Raisin who described Chinese Jewry in this way. They, the Chinese Jews, constantly increased in number in China, producing wise and cultured people. So with all this information in mind, it makes perfect sense when the Catholic journalist uh, Isvan Bakoni says, but it seems to be a special characteristic of Chinese Judaism, as many Israelite historians have said, and also these archaeological monuments confirm that Chinese Jews, Tao Q Kiao, were experts in agriculture. That's the Chinese name for those who remove the sinew. Call it TKK for abbreviation purposes. These TKKs had allowed them to infiltrate among the peasants, just as great military talents have also allowed their infiltration in the army, creating a fifth column of Israelite imperialism infiltrated at all levels of China. So it may be new information for some to come to see how influential these Chinese Jews were, but you'll see this influence continues to grow and be exerted exponentially. And by the 19th and 20th century, these Chinese Jews continue to gain more power. Diaspora Jews began to come to China themselves and were also helping to facilitate the growth of Jewish Chinese influence. And there was clearly a collaboration that was between them, as seen during the rise of communism in China. And as I briefly mentioned, the first prime minister of China was one of these Chinese Jews. So there's an academic paper on the history of Jews in Shanghai, which records that Jewish traders were among the first foreigners to come to work and live in Shanghai when the port was first opened to foreign trade in November of 1843. Despite the important role a number of these Jewish residents played in Shanghai, as well as the international commerce at that time and for the century to follow, scholars are just beginning to focus their attention on this community. Furthermore, there's an article written by a Jew which states that Shanghai was a city of tremendous opportunities, an international city open and free to all who wished to come there and make a quick fortune. The Babylonian Jews took full advantage of this and were extremely successful. I believe he's alluding to the Sassoon family, which came from Iraq and were at the crux and the fulcrum of spreading opium throughout China with the help of other Chinese Jews of these surnames aforementioned. So there's another article coming from a Jew writing on the Jews of Shanghai. There was a large and very Jewish community in old Shanghai. These were some of the richest people in the city and built many of the grandest structures, including the Cathay Hotel on the Bund. The Times of Israel openly admits that these Jews ran Shanghai. Among these Jews were the Sassoons, the Rothschilds of the East. So you could find an article on the website called Forward, and it's a Jewish press, and it states when Jews were kings and opium lords in Shanghai. And there's an article by Haaretz, This Day in Jewish History, 1864. Global trade tycoon David Sassoon dies. So it's fair to say what would become the century of humiliation in China was influenced by these Jews, and they were the people who instigated this century of suffering for the majority of the people of China, while Jews got fat and rich. I need to step away for just a short while. If you mind just kind of picking up,
Okay.
I'll be back in a short moment.
So the earliest records of the Sassoon and Kaifeng. Let me close this real quick. Okay. Um, they collaborated in 1850 is when they started, and that the Chinese Jews were obviously helping and working with all the diaspora Jews that started moving in, and not just with the Sassoons. Um, an example of the collaboration that demonstrates other significant tasks being completed between the Chinese Jews and the new Jews that moved in is a man named Bruno Schindler, who was actively involved. He was the editor and head of publishing firm for Lund Humphreys and Co. Limited, as well as founder and editor of Journal Asia Major and co-founder and publisher of the Journal Islamica Kazakhstan and Armenia. During a visit in Shanghai in 1913, he helped found the Jewish community there. And in early 20th century, around the 1920s, Jewish Soviet agents who, while in Kefang, established relationships with the remnants of the Jewish community there. As a result of Jewish domination in China in the 1800s and 1900s, Shanghai turned into a haven for thousands of Russian Jews fleeing revolution in the 1920s. Kind of sounds like another version of Israel. Um, in the next decade, some 20,000 Jews came to escape Hitler's Germany. These Russian Jews were not fleeing, they were Jewish Bolsheviks and sent to China to become senior advisors to the future heads of the CCP. And it says this topic will be expanded on in the later of the article. It was also during the 19th, 20th centuries that the Jews worked to lay the foundations of Freemasonry in China. The Jews became leaders of the lodges as well. Masonry was an important agent of business advancement and social integration with the foreign community and provided relaxation away from less salubrious diversions around abounding in Shanghai. Jews had no difficulty in rising up the ranks of Freemasonry, and many served as the masters of their lodges. The District Grand Lodge of North China, constituted at Shanghai on 9 of November 1877, had several high ranking Jewish members, in quotes. The author also states that the 1920s continued success of the Jews in the Freemasonry. It was constituted in 1877, as stated before, and never ceased. Shanghai Sephardim were well represented in the Freemasonry lodges, and several belonged to more than one of the 11 lodges in the North China district. And then
Can
it,
can you read that article that's in the Jewish Chronicle? Can you make that
okay.
out?
So this is a article from 20 of December 1907, Freemasonry, to the editor of the Jewish Chronicle. Sir, in reference to the above subject, there is not, nor can there be, any objection to Jewish brethren rising to the highest officer, either in craft or royal arc masonry, has been ever universally admitted by the order that to part masonry and Judaism is impossible. In fact, to use a well known axiom amongst us, Judaism is masonry and masonry is Judaism. How can it be otherwise when the very foundation of the order is of the Bible, biblical, as so to render it impossible to bring anything of sectarian tendency to the question by alluding to the juxtaposition of the Old and New Testament? Granted, your correspondent is all he says. Sorry, it's very um,
It's a bit grainy and small, so
as a past master, he ought to know that in our order we recognize no creed that Jew, Christian, Turk, or Hindu alike meet on equality. And this is law to the greatest safeguard that we of the order possess. Your correspondent is evidently a young Mason, although, as he says, a decorated past master, and is painfully vague when he says it is known. Then it cuts off. Then there is another section on the Talmud and the Gospels. I don't know if this, yeah, this doesn't look like it really pertains to it. Um, yeah, so let me go back to, so they're saying that there was clearly a Masonic network put in the place by Jews, and a combination of crypto Chinese Jews and outside diaspora Jews dominated these lodges. Next, the Jews sought to extend the B'nai B'rith lodges in China and managed to do so by 1928. I believe B'nai B'rith was the group that was basically a terrorist organization in Israel.
but
Um,
B'nai B'rith is Freemasonry specifically for Jews. Only Jews can join, and you must be of a certain percentage of Jew to join B'nai B'rith. It's, if I'm not mistaken, founded in America, and some of the people that supported Leo Frank and helped create the ADL were B'nai B'rith, Leo Frank being a member of B'nai B'rith himself. So I don't believe it originated in Israel. If I'm not mistaken, it was an organization created in the United States. And if you look at its charter, some of the imagery is associated with Freemasonry, being like the two pillars of Joachim and Boaz, and the symbol of Jacob's ladder, and with the top of the ladder being illuminated by light, and the all-seeing eye. So B'nai B'rith has been very influential globally, particularly here in America, but as stated by this article, lodges in China.
Okay,
So
so it goes on to talk about the two-step process to bring communism to China. The first step was the First Sino-Japan War from 1894 to 1895. Jews brought China to communism through the first and main task, which was creating a movement to overthrow the Qing dynasty. The Jews managed to do this by first using the stabilizer of the First Sino-Japan War, causing political upheavals led by Sun Yat-sen that resulted in the 1911 revolution and the formation of a republic, which was created in faking anti-communism for future dialectic of Chinese nationalists and Chinese communists. During the period of the republic, they consolidated, defined, and unified the Chinese territory, which was for a time under control of the diverse military cliques. This was known as the warlord era, so essentially causing false flags. Um, from 1900 to 1949, when the Jewish communists took power over 8,963,000 people were killed as a result of the struggle for the republicanism in China. Um, then in 1912, Sun Yat sen appointed Jintao, the founder of the Bank of China, to chief financial officer and the head of the Central Audit Office in Beijing. And then in 1924, Sun established the centralization of the Chinese banking system.
Would you look
Um,
at that? They they make their way in and create a system of control,
so,
usually in the in the sc- in the scope of financial control, as they always do, as discussed in the episode about England, Jews being kicked out of 109 countries 1,030 times. These expulsions usually were the result of either ritual child sacrifice or the people and sometimes the government being fed up with the impact of usury.
so in the next quote, New China refers to the early republic that was formed after the fall of the last dynasty. In the Euro-Asian Jewish Congress, in the history of New China after Xinjiang, which in parentheses they call them the bourgeoisie, um, revolution of 1911, Jews were actively involved in the formation of a new state. The absence of anti Semitism in the Chinese cultural tradition, the support of authorities from the emperors to leaders of the Republic of China and the People's Republic of China allowed Jewish communities of China to go along and the prosperous path of development. They helped create New China and they were honored in the New China for decades to follow. Um, Here's a small article clip. While in Beijing, Ai Fenming and Shi Fenying introduced themselves as Jews. They were well received at the National Day celebration. They participated in all activities, including a state banquet hosted by Premier Zhao Enlai. In 16 October, the People's Daily, a major newspaper run by the Central Committee of Communist Party, cited that the Jews as one of the 46 ethnic groups that participated in the banquet, an indication that the Kaifeng Jews were considered one of the separate ethnic groups. One may feel that Jews in Kaifeng were lucky in New China. They were honored simply because they were Jews. This was the first community recognition that they received in 1,000 years they had been in China. No Jew elsewhere had ever enjoyed the same honor. Seemingly, their identity was no problem at all. Here
I I,
is
th- I think it's important to briefly mention the individual who was responsible for helping facilitate this, Zhu Enlai, uh, the first prime minister of China, as mentioned. Zhu Enlai was a prominent Chinese political leader, best known for serving as the first prime minister of the People's Republic of China from its inception in 1949 until his death in 1976. Born into an aristocratic family in 1891, Zhu's early life was marked by instability, which led him to a rigorous education that cultivated interest in Marxism. He became involved in revolutionary activities in China during the early 20th century, participating in pivotal events like the May 4th movement and later helping establish the Chinese Communist Party. Throughout his political career, Zhu played a crucial role in both domestic governance and international diplomacy. He was instrumental in organizing forces during the Civil War with the Kuomintang and served as a key figure during World War II, facilitating cooperation between the CCP and Kuomintang against Japanese aggression. After the establishment of the PRC, People's Republic of China, Zhu worked closely with Mao Zedong, implementing socialist policies, promoting gender equality, and leading China through tumultuous periods such as the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. Zhou's diplomatic efforts were significant as he sought to elevate China's status on the global stage, notably through key conferences in the 1950s. His legacy reflects a balanced act between tradition and modernity. He sought to navigate China through a complex political landscape while maintaining stability and promoting national unity. He's often viewed he is often viewed as a stabilizing force within the communist regime, contrasting with Mao's more dominant leadership style. Zhu Enlai's contributions to Chinese society and governance continue to be recognized and studied for their importance in the context of 20th century China.
Okay, so then there is also um, Andriva Svitlana Gendiva, candidate of historical sciences. Thus, the parties that emerged during the Xinhai Revolution largely bore the features of traditional associations. Family or provincial affiliation was a decisive factor in creation of the party. In some cases, traditional Chinese secret societies became the main party. Jiangming, a Freemason, supported Sun Yat sen's revolutionary efforts to overthrow the Qing dynasty. Therefore, Sun Yat sen's revolution had the support of Freemasonry. So, the Qing dynasty was, I believe, their golden age, and they had been doing excellent up until around that time. Um, and then these gentlemen, through the support of Freemasonry, overthrew that, is what that's saying.
And
So,
this is similar to what we see in America today, where Jews at some point began to trickle in, exert influence. As stated, the Great Seal of the United States, which was made in 1782, which has the eagle, stars and stripes, and the eagle is clutching 13 arrows and uh, two olive branches, or maybe it's 13 olive branches with, or two with 13 leaves, whatever the case may be. Above the Great Seal of the United States is a set of 13 stars, which make up the Star of Remphan, or Star of David as it's known by Jews. So there's the practice of putting in footholds, setting down roots, assimilating outwardly, and then when it's time to strike, they once they have acquired enough influence, they begin to try and take over the country and shift it towards totalitarian Jewish control.
the um, more Bolsheviks came to China shortly after that revolution. The Russian Jewish magazine L'Chaim in 1914 and after the 1917. This is quoting. Uh, in 1914 and after the 1917 revolution, Jews began Jews again pulled from Russia to China. The largest community then appeared in Harbin, 25,000 people. Newspapers were published, Jewish hospitals and schools were opened, and Zionist organizations arose. Until the 1930s, there was an intense cultural life in both Russian and Jewish communities in China. Earlier in the article, there were a couple sources that were displayed many Bolshevik Jews coming to China during the 1910s to 1930s as well. Where'd you go?
Sorry, I took a sip of my beer. I didn't want to do that on
Okay.
camera, just in case
So,
it's foreboding.
okay. So, in the second step, the Second Japanese Sino War from 1937 to 1945, the war was that was to turn over the republic and install a communism. Um, David Crook, a Jew who was a communist ideologue and spy, recruited to the NKVD Soviet secret police and was sent to China during the Second Japanese Sino War. Um, let's see, where was that cited? Um, sorry. So Harry
No, it's
Dexter White was a senior U.S. Treasury Department official and a major architect of the IMF, as well as its first director. During the Chinese Civil War, 1927 to 1947, he intentionally destroyed the economy of nationalist China, financially crippling their middle class, and this destabilized the administration of the Jiang Kai-shek in preparation for him to be defeated and communism imposed, which is kind of interesting that kind of the opposite happened in Russia. If you're familiar with a guy, an economist named Jeffrey Sachs, who's um, oddly been getting a lot more attention lately, I think restoring his name um, because he's good on the Israel topic. He actually instituted a thing called shock treatment during the end of the Soviet era in Russia. And it basically caused a giant famine and for all of these oligarchs to start being able to acquire all the land because so many people had to sell off their properties and so I mean in one way it's very similar. It's just under a different name and they're calling it more of a capitalist way. um
it's the same practice,
yeah.
rinse and repeat. They did this in Paradise, California. They've did it in Maui to build these smart cities. They move in, create an event, or slowly strangle the local population and middle class through their sphere of influence. They cozy up to the form of government which operates, whether it be a king or uh, democracy as it's, known to us. And they buy the people who are in positions of influence. They prop them up, they blackmail them, and they get to work.
So in what I was just citing about Harry Dexter White, the U.S. Treasury Department official, there's an article by the New York Times which is dated March 18th of 1965, which is only a few years before all of our industrialization was handed over to China and we went off the gold standard. Um, in the New York Times, the title is Harry Dexter White Accused on China. Washington, March 17th. A professor charged in a Senate document released today that the late Harry Dexter White, accused by the Federal Bureau of Investigation and others of being a Soviet spy, deliberately tried to wreck China's monetary system during World War II. So, um, and then he was 30 to I don't know why they're showing that picture. Um, so in
For those who don't know, behind Dylan is the port of Shanghai, and he put that lovely photo up for us to see what would become the
what it
old.
looks like today versus what it used
Yeah,
to be.
right.
Um, so it was because of the Jews' unseen control over Japan, in combination with the international Jewish finance influencing Japan, they were able to execute this two-step process successfully. The Jewish finance that played a critical role in the recognition of Japan's emergence on the world stage in the first place. Consequently, in an article Shift played a critical role. Why is it okay?
I think
Doesn't
it's
say.
important to mention when discussing the Chinese or the Sino Wars, the wars between China and Japan, that Japan has always been a very homogenous society that has strict cultures, practices, and traditions. Like I'm a big fan of sumo wrestling. Sumo in sumo, women aren't allowed to practice sumo. It's any organizations in which women practice sumo is in no way associated with the sumo governing body of Japan. And they believe for a woman to touch the doyo, the ring that's built out of clay for each tournament, they would defile um, the, the sacred nature of the ring. And there was a gentleman who had a heart attack and was, you know, probably on the verge of death. And a woman tried to come in and give him CPR, and the announcer came over the loudspeaker and said, get off the dojo. And he was cool letting that dude die to protect the traditions of Japan. And the Japanese, prior to World War II, in the years leading up to it, I believe in the 5 years leading up to it, had expelled Freemasonry and a great number of Jews. So the relationship between China and Japan, although on the surface is just, oh, these Japanese aggressors and their need for expansion, but in reality, it's in my opinion underlined by the fact that these Jews of China resent the Japanese history of tradition and culture, and they seek to undermine it. And we're finding that was it happened under Shinzo Abe. There is a talk and discussion that took place that he was planning on removing the American military bases from Japan. And 3 days after this conversation, the Fukushima incident occurred after like a 9.4 off the coast of Japan after American slash Jewish, you know, weapons were used to create an earthquake. And then it wasn't long after, I don't know how long in fact, before Shinzo Abe was assassinated, but he was eventually, gunned down by someone they attributed to being a member of the Unitarian Church of Japan, some sort of like cult like church that was involved in a Japanese terrorist attack where they used gas on trains, killing a bunch of people.
Oh,
But
that
they claim
cult.
it.
That was a cult.
Yeah, yeah, and but that's a particular uh, church that's somewhat associated with Christianity in the manner in which it's presented publicly and in the media. But they claim the assailant who had assassinated Shinzo Abe was a member of this particular church. But I found that important to mention when discussing the Sino-Japanese War, that Japan, in my opinion, of all the Asians, they're probably the best, if not the best, and they have a sense of identity and culture, and they're not willing to bend it and shape it at the behest of international influence, and I respect that. And we need more of that if we're going to do something about the degradation of society we find ourselves in today.
So I don't have a lot of time left, but it's saying stating that The three main characters of the process that we just spoke about, the first step and the second step, essentially the Japanese Sino Wars. The main characters of this were Sun Yat sen, that we discussed, Chiang Kai shek, and Mao Zedong. Each of them individually examined, you'll see what it basically ties them together in the end. Sun Yat sen, he was a Freemason. His wife was Jewish. Um, he had Jewish handlers outside of Freemasonry. Um, uh, John D. Rockefeller was involved in his overthrow. Then we have Sun Yat sen, who had Jewish senior advisors through his time as leader. Um,
I believe
his
Sun Yat-sen, we're going to come to see, was very heavily involved and being like almost similar to Haman in the story in the book of Esther, in relation to the king at the time of Persia, where he was essentially the right hand man and his um, advisor on policy. So what we'll come to see when discussing the creation of communism and where we find ourselves today, that Yat-sen was very much involved, and again, a Freemason being a Jewish institution. I know you have to go soon because there's only so much time we have together today. Did you want to cut it sometime soon, that so that when we pick up where we left off, we can dive deeply into communism and then eventually trade being moved, or manufacturing being moved from the United States to China? Or
I think we could
I'm
stop here and then pick up again here because there's a good amount of information on all three of these individuals, and I definitely like to dig in more on Mao Zedong, who's mentioned in here. Obviously, such a big name and had such a huge impact on not just China but the entire world. Um, so, um,
The plan for this was always a two-parter, folks, so pardon us if we're cutting this short. The amount of data that we're going over, being I like to get into the minutia and details of how these things occurred, and I don't like to just say it's the Jews and point to one individual or the other. I think it's important to paint a picture and lay out a bit of groundwork, set a foundational approach to the subject being discussed, pardon, and then build on it from there. So, hey, thanks, Dylan, for the opportunity to do this again. I um I thought this was something that a lot of people may not be familiar with, but I think it's an important um, subject to broach, specifically when considering, where we find ourselves in America today, and the idea that once Jews have squeezed America dry, they're going to move to their next host. And there was an article, I'll try and pull it up for next week, that discussed Israel looking east towards China,
okay.
as um, America's economy self implodes. But yeah, thanks for participating in what we presented here this evening, folks. If you're listening to it um, after this live tonight, um, like, share, subscribe, leave a comment, and if there's anything you wish to contribute, I'd be happy to dig into it um, in the time before our next presentation, completing our discussion on the history of Jews in China.
All right. Have a good night, folks.